Good evening. What a crowd. We had over 800 responses. There's an overflow room, as some of you who are hearing this in the overflow room know, but it's delightful to have so many. And think about the competition, right? We have the rain. We have the World Series, although you know that's going to go on until at least 1 a.m. We also have the third Republican debate. So it's pretty obvious that there is an answer to the new trivia question. What do Ben Carson and Barbara King have in common? They both trump Trump. I'm Michael Halloran, the provost at William & Mary. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's 8th Tack Faculty Lecture given by Professor Barbara King. Now, the premise in establishing this lecture series was simple. Our intellectual energy as a university comes primarily from the creative work of the faculty as they conduct research and lead students in a quest for new knowledge and deeper understanding. So we should not hide our light under a bushel, but rather let it shine brightly. Carl and Martha Tack, both class of 1978, recognized the value of displaying this intellectual energy in a public forum, and through their generous endowment, we will be able to enjoy the Tack Faculty Lecture Series in perpetuity. I should also add that Carl's and Martha's William & Mary's roots run over 4 centuries, and Carl himself is a frequent professor at our Mason School of Business. Carl is with us this evening. Carl, wave a hand. And my warm thanks to both you and Martha. Barbara King is the Chancellor Professor of Anthropology. She received her PhD from the University of Oklahoma, joined the William & Mary faculty in 1988, and for nearly 30 years has been an invaluable scholar, thinker, and teacher. Her excellence has been recognized locally, regionally, nationally, and even internationally. She won our Thomas Jefferson Teaching Award, the university's highest recognition of teaching, and she followed up the next year with the state's Outstanding Faculty Award. Before becoming a Chancellor Professor, she was named University Professor for Teaching Excellence, and then the Class of 2007 Professor. In 2002, she received a highly prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship, and last year, her Scientific America article, When Animals Mourn, was selected for inclusion in the Best American Science and Nature Writing 2014. Her work is also recognized on the other side of the pond. She has won France's Prix Littéraire 30 Millions d'Amis for the French translation of her latest book, How Animals Grieve. Professor King's scholarship has covered an impressively wide range of important subjects. She has written about the origin of religion, social information transfers among monkeys, apes, and hominids, human development in the 21st century, and how animals grieve. Next year, she will publish a new book entitled Animals We Eat. In very recent years, she has extended her reach to an even wider audience through her frequent lectures, opinion pieces, weekly contributions to NPR's 13.7 Cosmos and Culture blog, and essays in the Times Literary Supplement and the Washington Post and other venues. In short, Professor King has become a public intellectual with a powerful voice on the rights of animals, including those of Homo sapiens. Tonight, as the Tack Faculty Lecturer, Professor King will explore with us her deep research and keen insights into the emotional world of animals in her talk, Wild Grief, Untamed Love, Emotions in the Animal World. Barbara?
Well, good evening, and Provost Halloran, I'm making you a professor. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and I also want to take a moment and thank Carl and Martha Tack, because it is through your generosity that I'm here this evening. And if I can just take a minute to say, wow. I mean, we really did fill the house, and that's thanks to you. I'd like to thank each of you for being here. And I know we're in an overflow room as well. I know we're live streaming, so it's very exciting, and I'm really very happy to be here. And animals are the love of my life and a very favorite topic of mine, obviously, so I'm looking very much forward to plunging right in tonight. We live with animals in our lives, of course. I would predict that very many of you here, when you leave today, will go home to live with animals. We live with cats and dogs and birds and snakes, horses and pigs, and even snails. And I mention snails because there's a wonderful book written by Elizabeth Tova Bailey, who talks about what it's like to have a snail as a companion animal. So I want to think, yeah, she really had this little terrarium next to her bed, and she kept the snail, and it changed her life in certain ways. She wrote very lyrically about it. And so I want to be open when we talk about animals tonight, wild animals, captive animals, and a whole range of different types of animals. What my aims are, you see here before you. They are 4 tonight. I really would like to talk mostly about grief. I want to lighten the mood occasionally and talk about love, but my research over the last years has been focused largely on mourning and grief. I want to talk about what that means, what definitions we can use for these emotions in animals, and give you some examples. I think it's important too, though, because after all, I am an anthropologist, to talk about human uniqueness. How does our species grieve differently than other species? And we don't have to mean that humans are somehow infinitely superior because we're different, but there is a balance between continuities with other animals and uniquenesses of our species. Additionally, it's extremely important to me that we talk a little bit about what does this mean for animals? I don't want in my life to be just a scholar of animal studies. I want also to be a person who works for animals. And I do consider myself more and more as time goes on to be an animal activist. And I want to talk about that aspect of things. At the end of the lecture, I just want to reserve a very few minutes for sharing some emotions of mine with you. And I'll explain that more when the time comes. So tonight I'm going to start in Brazil's Atlantic forest. This is the Amazonian region of South America, and tell you about some small monkeys that live in the trees. This is work that was published by Brazilian primatologists last year. It is not covered in my book. It is new information. And these common marmosets are small monkeys. They live in pairs, so that a male and a female will together produce offspring and stay together for many years. The older siblings take care of the younger siblings. It's a very cooperative family type of structure. And the Brazilian primatologists one day noticed that 2 monkeys that they called M1b and F1b, the dominant pair in the forest, had a very unusual event occur. M1b, being a good father, as these monkeys tend to be, was taking care of twins high up in the canopy. And unfortunately, his partner, F1b, fell to the forest floor, which is a very long way, and she also struck her head as she was coming down. When the male noticed this, he came down to the forest floor very quickly and had what was very clearly a distressed response. He used his body to cover that of his mate, and he acted extremely in an agitated manner. When the primatologist talked about this to the BBC, the lead researcher said, and I quote, "When I observed the dominant male approach the dying female, his gentle care and attention towards her left me astounded." Now I understand that. I believe it would have been a moving event and a distressing one to see in an unexpected manner in the middle of a field day. But that word, astounded, really struck me, and I started to think about it. And I wonder, should we really feel amazed and astounded when we see that other animals express care, express affection, express mourning? And I'd like to talk to you about that. Interestingly, one of our alums, Peter Fasching, who graduated from here in 1991, was interviewed by a journalist about this very event with M1b and F1b. He was asked by a journalist from Science Now what he thought about the matter. He is a primatologist who has a long-term field study in the highlands of Ethiopia, working on gelada baboons. And Peter said, "It is especially interesting because marmosets are cooperative breeders with unusually strong male-female bonds. We would expect that these animals would be especially affected by the loss of their primary mating and social partner." And in fact, the two monkeys concerned had been partners for 3 years and produced 8 offspring. Notice the difference there between what would astound us and what we would expect. And this is a very new field for anthropology, for biology, to be thinking about animals' response to death. So we're really caught in that current of trying to understand when should we expect to see this. And that's part of what I'm working on. One of the reasons why I was very happy, besides the fact that it's our alum who started in my primate behavior class who got interviewed for this very important article, this was a very significant statement that Peter made, because he himself has seen what we might call negative observations of grief, or the absence of grief, in his highland monkeys. So occasionally an infant will die among these baboons, and the female will grasp the infant and keep it against her body for not only hours, but days and weeks. And unfortunately, the body at some point is not in very good shape, and she's still clutching it. But meanwhile, this female goes about her life and does everything that she normally would do. She eats normally, she is resting and grooming, and sometimes, and this is a really bit bizarre, she's also mating with this infant. This is clearly an absence of any visible expression of grief. And in understanding this, it underscores the point that we really want to look at both the presence and the absence of these emotions, and that's what Peter is trying to do, to understand where they occur and where they don't occur. I took this picture outside our home in Gloucester, which is of a large number of very loud crows. And I was wondering what they were vocalizing about. I did not figure it out. But I was interested to see that just this month in the Science Times, the New York Times section on Tuesdays that's devoted to science, Carl Zimmer, who's a very distinguished science journalist, wrote up a particular study about how crows respond to death in their social companions. And I don't have a lot of time to talk about the specifics of that study, but I rather want to focus on the conclusion that he ended the Science Times article with, and I'm just going to read it to you. That's not to say, even though crows do pay attention to their dead, that every animal pays attention to its dead. In fact, the club is fairly exclusive, including species such as chimpanzees, elephants, dolphins, and relatives of crows known as scrub jays. Well, I'm here to tell you tonight that I don't think the club is as exclusive as a lot of scientists have been saying. I'm joining with a number of people who have been working on animal emotion to say that we have the data to show that, in fact, this is a much more widespread type of process. And of course, that's what I'll be giving you examples of in just a minute. I do want to say, though, that it's very important to be cautious, to be conservative. We don't necessarily want to jump to conclusions based on a few minutes observation or a video. Now, you can fire up your computer and you can find all kinds of videos that claim to show not only animal grief, but in some cases, as you see here, death rituals. This is a video that you can find on the internet that is labeled a magpie death ritual. And obviously, something interesting is happening here. This is in a suburban context. And people who live in a home have noticed that a magpie has fallen to the ground and has died. And the other birds are gathering around. They're vocalizing. They're doing things that they probably wouldn't normally be doing. And yet, I have no idea what's happening here. I would not want to say, this is a ritual, this is grief. And my point is that we really have to look more deeply than just a picture in the media or a video or something that's very intriguing. We need to look very carefully at the animals that we're talking about. Now, the A word. I have been every day, probably for the last 10 years, someone has come up to me and said, but what about anthropomorphism? What is anthropomorphism? It's the projection of human qualities onto animal lives. And what is really meant by that typically is the inappropriate projection. In other words, we have to be really careful that we don't just decide that what we feel in a certain context, an animal might feel in that context. Point taken. But I'd ask you a question. What makes, for example, love, sadness, grief, joy, what makes them human qualities? Why would we start from the position that they are ours to decide whether other animals have or not, and that other animals only have them if they're like us? Maybe we could flip that around and think differently about the animal kingdom and think that maybe these are very widespread emotions. Let's look and find out. So, as far as that exclusive club is concerned, I say no. I have very good, I think, examples and case studies, only some of which I can tell you about tonight, that include farmed animals like cows and goats and pigs and chickens, our companion animals, and dogs and cats and birds, and of course wild animals. And I don't want to give you the impression that those of us who are working on this are, of course, innovating. We're not bringing up these questions for the first time. It's pretty obligatory for an evolutionary scientist to mention Darwin. So here are the two slides that now give me my card-carrying Darwin credentials. In 1872, Darwin published this book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. So you can see that is quite a while after his famous On the Origins. He is very interested in looking at a wide variety of animals because he thinks he's seeing joy and sadness and fear and grief. He commissioned drawings of the animals that he was looking at, and he used words very freely without worrying about whether they belonged to our species only. He has this drawing of the dog in this book and refers to this as a benevolent dog. He has a drawing of this monkey and says the monkey is pleased. In the case of the juvenile chimpanzee, he uses the word sulky and disappointed. This is a pout face. And he's quite willing to use these words, as very typically we could conclude about Darwin in a number of contexts. He was very ahead of his time in thinking this way. Well, Darwin, as I mentioned, didn't just rely on the writings of others. He went to observe animals and look at them in various contexts. This is well after the voyage of the Beagle. And in the 1830s, he went to London Zoo to look at an orangutan that had been acquired there. And this is a sad story in the sense that we know at this time, apes that were taken away from the wild into zoos didn't live very long, and this orangutan didn't live very long. But while she was part of the London Zoo, she was hugely popular. The Queen came, there were dense crowds everywhere, and Darwin came too. And he met Jenny, the orangutan. And in his notebook, not in a publication, in his notebook, this is what he wrote. Let man visit orangutan in domestication, hear expressive whine, see its intelligence when spoken to, as if it understands every word said. See its affection to those it knew, see its passion and rage, sulkiness and very actions of despair, and then let him boast of his proud preeminence. Man in his arrogance thinks himself a great work, worthy the interposition of a deity, more humble and I believe true to consider him created from animals. So in the 19th century, there was intense interest in animal emotion. And we certainly don't have time to do a historical primer here, but I will tell you that that interest was soon overtaken by very hardcore skeptics who were extremely uncomfortable with using the words thinking and feeling in connection to animals at all. And this study very much fell out of favor for a long time. There is a renaissance now of studying animal thinking and feeling. It is part of this critical animal turn, we call it in the academy, the idea that we're seeing animals in a new light. We're understanding that they feel their lives profoundly, that they do think, that using these words to describe what they do is absolutely appropriate and not a projection. So I consider myself lucky to be among various scientists who are working on this. I just project pictures here of two of them, Virginia Morell and Mark Bekoff, And if you read anything in the realm of animal emotions, these names will be familiar to you. Although I have to say, I'm very curious about this phenomenon of the dog. It seems to be obligatory. If you're an emotion scientist, to pose with a dog. I have no dog, so I'm here before you dogless. I do have, however, a large number of cats. And so for cat people, yes, you're here tonight. Okay. For cat people in the audience, we will come back to cats very soon. Many, many cats, right? Charlie, my husband would agree, many cats. Okay. So when I wrote this book, How Animals Grieve, and I published a companion piece in Scientific American called When Animals Mourn, I had a basic structure that I wanted to lay out of the work that I've been doing. All of this has its roots in my early work in anthropology, which involved studying learning in free-ranging baboons in Kenya, and going on to study the gestural communication of apes in various captive locations like the National Zoological Park, where many of you have been in Washington, and also Georgia State University. So I began to see how smart these apes were, and of course we knew that, but I saw it with my own eyes. I got to think about the problems they were solving and the complex ways in which they were communicating with each other, and I began to think more about emotions. And as the years went by, I became interested in not just our closest primate cousins, but many other animals as well. So my idea was to try to come up with some definitions that would take us further than these very casual observations that are so popular of particularly animal grief. But I really want to make sure that we look at an animal who's now become a survivor. Some companion has died and the animal is a survivor. We have to have had known about the behavioral routines of that animal before the death in question and after. We need a comparative basis and really have not just an anecdote, but qualitative data about the life experiences of these animals and to see if there's an absence of mourning, a presence of mourning, or whatever. So when I went to do this, I relied some on my own observations, but also very heavily on the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And I did extensive interviews with wildlife researchers, sanctuary and zoo staff, and just basic animal people. I'm one of them. People who live with animals, think about what their animals do, and describe what their animals do. So the last thing I want to say before I get into some examples is just to really underscore the fact that it's enormously popular now to have viral videos that are meant to tell us something about animals. And in one hand, this is wonderful. You know, I come home from teaching all day, and I've had a great day, and I'm tired, and I, just like anyone else, want to look at animal videos. But this is not the way we do science. This is not science. So here, I'm going to give you an example. This is a baby elephant. And obviously, you see, the baby elephant is going into the sea, into the ocean. And in this particular case, this was the first time this baby elephant had ever seen the ocean. And have any of you, could you just tell me, have you seen this video? This has gone absolutely viral. Okay, some of you have. And it's presented as, here is the joy of a baby elephant having this playful experience. And in fact, if we watch just a little bit more, you'll soon see in a minute that the elephant dives into the waves. And the looseness of the way that the trunk is moving and the limbs are moving does give us a sense. This is a happy baby, right? You see that and you say, this is joy, this is happiness. And that is true. But what we also might know, if we investigate further, is that these baby elephants have, out of camera range, their controller with a sharp stick in their hand, who really disciplines them, treats them not very well, uses the babies frolicking in the sea to get money from tourists, and then only part of the video is shown. You know, we just can't do science from video. You have to be there and you have to watch what's going on. So I learned from my animal activist friends that what you think you may be seeing is not always what is actually happening in terms of how animals are treated and the range of the emotions that they may be feeling. Okay, so what I want to say in terms of definitions is, first of all, that some neuroscientists differentiate between an emotion and a feeling. So that you have a bodily state. When you get into a fear state, your whole body sort of physiologically changes. And in some cases, these scientists say, that's an emotion, but only when you become aware of and reflect upon the bodily state can we call it a feeling. And I felt it important to acknowledge that these terms are not always used completely interchangeably, but I am going to use them interchangeably tonight. When I think about these terms, I like to use relatively straightforward definitions, and you see them here. Thought is the process of considering something that's been perceived. Emotion is how we feel about our perception. So I'm not trying to define grief and love. I'm trying to come up with ways to describe and measure the expression of emotion in animals, the visible expression of emotion. So what do? For grief, I look before and after, again, around the event of a death, and see, has a survivor become socially withdrawn? Is this animal now not eating, not sleeping? Is there a different facial or bodily affect or posture, different vocalizations, different facial expressions? Again, this requires a period of time of knowing the animal. Now, the question of love is a little bit more fraught for me. When I wrote How Animals Grieve, I asked this question right away on page 8. Is it outlandish to write of animal love? How could we ever recognize what love is to an ape, much less to a goat? Can we recognize always love in each other? Can we define human love? So what I've decided is that I feel very strongly that the language that I was taught in graduate school is not adequate. I was taught that animals have affiliative pair bonds that increase their reproductive success. All of these very cold and sterile and technical terms. And that's important to know, to learn. I teach some of these terms. Some of my students are here. You will have heard of them. But it does not go far enough, because I do think that in some cases, animals are not just enhancing their reproductive success by hanging out with their partner. So what I want to do is I want to look at animals who choose to spend time together over and above survival contexts. And I want to work very hard on describing the quality and intensity of what they're doing with each other. Will I always successfully tell the difference between friendship and love, for example? No. This is a new enterprise, as I've mentioned, but I would ask you to think about in your lives. Do we always know the difference between love and friendship? Is there always a difference between love and friendship? These questions are very challenging for humans, for each other, much less applying them to animals. But this doesn't mean that we shouldn't apply them. We should, and we should really look hard at what the animals are doing. So let's get to some of the examples. I'm going to start with the gold standard of elephants, because they are absolutely the animals we know the most about when it comes to this topic. In Samburu National Park in Kenya, there was an elephant who was a matriarch of one of the families named ELEANOR. She appeared one day with a swollen trunk, a bruised leg, and was swaying in a way that looked as if she would be weak or ill. In fact, at this point, the matriarch of another family came up to her, and you see on the left that Grace has now approached ELEANOR and is trying to prop her up with her trunks. These, of course, are big, powerful animals. So we have two females here. They're just glommed together, one trying to help the other. Unfortunately, Grace could not hold up ELEANOR for very long, and she did collapse, and the next day she died. And what happened, as Ian Douglas Hamilton and colleagues have published, is that there was a literal parade over the next week of elephants from 5 different families that came and stood at her body. In some cases, this was not grief. This was exploration, curiosity, putting the trunk or a foot over the body and moving on. Interestingly, none of the bull elephants came. These were females and juveniles. And some of the females stayed. They stood at the body and they just stayed there. They appeared distressed. They stood over the body and they rocked back and forth and they wouldn't leave. And we know that this happens frequently. There are examples of elephants that are doing quite amazing things. I mentioned that I did my work in Amboseli National Park with baboons, and Cynthia Moss is a very famous elephant researcher based there for decades. And she can watch as elephants cross the savanna and approach elephant bones. And she knows, because she knows who those bones used to be, that the kin of that dead individual often comes and visits the bones, picks them up in the trunk, strokes them, puts them down, and moves on. This is very mysterious. We don't fully understand this scientifically, but it does happen. We know that the monkeys and apes, the animals that I've studied, also express different ways of grieving. This is a study I want to tell you about that's interesting because it's both hormonal and observational in its approach. Anne Ang and colleagues in the OKAVANGO Delta of Botswana watched a group of baboons and did an analysis of their glucocorticoid levels. These are circulating stress levels of hormones in the body. And they found that after 22 females had together witnessed a predator attack on the group, naturally, as you can imagine, their stress levels went up. But what was interesting is that the females who had lost someone close to them, a close friend, a close associate, or a close relative, their glucocorticoid levels went up much, much more. And these lasted for a couple of weeks. I was very interested to see that Anne Ang was, in talking with me, was willing to say that this was the chemical signature of bereavement. But what was more interesting to me as someone who uses observation is that she studied baboon pairs and saw this visible expression of grief in this situation. You see here Sierra and Sylvia, two baboons. Sylvia is the mother and Sierra is the daughter. They were unusually close. They spent hours together when they didn't, quote unquote, have to. They didn't need to forage together or protect each other. They just chose to groom together. And then very suddenly, Sierra, the daughter, was killed by a lion. Sylvia went into a completely different state. She withdrew socially. She'd been very high-ranking. She was not interested in hanging out with other monkeys, with grooming. She didn't eat. And these things allowed Anne Ang to conclude, again, that they were looking at grief in monkeys. And we have many other similar examples. In this particular body of water off of Greece, Joan Gonzalvo watched as a mother Atlantic bottlenose dolphin looked at her dying and then dead calf and protected this calf from others and kept the calf up in the water using her pectoral fins and her snout. This went on for 2 days. It's very clear that the mother understood there had been some terrible change in the state of her infant. These are very smart animals. It's not as if she's necessarily trying to revive the infant, but I want to read you what this researcher said. He decided not to collect the body, which some other scientists had wanted him to do for analysis. What prompted me not to interfere was respect. This is what he told me when I interviewed him. We were privileged to be able to witness such clear evidence of the mother-calf bond in bottlenose dolphins, a species that I have been studying for over a decade. I was more interested in observing that natural behavior than interrupting it by abruptly interfering and disturbing a mother who was already in obvious distress. I would define what I saw as mourning. Again, multiple examples scattered across continents of cetaceans, dolphins and whales with behavior like this. In some cases, the examples that I read, the mother was not alone, but would be escorted by 15 other dolphins who would spell her, hold the baby up, and if it started to sink, they would come to her rescue. They altered their travel patterns, they altered their feeding behavior. All of this went on for quite a long period of time. In all three cases then, the scientists who did the before and after analysis agreed that they were looking at bereavement or mourning or something along those lines. Now, this whole animal thanatology situation, as I've mentioned to you already, is very, very new. So I want to underscore 2 points. These are, again, in my view, not just anecdotes. They are qualitative research that's giving us a glimpse into the capacity of these animals for deep feeling. It's very hard to be in the right place at the right time to record data about an animal death. The other thing is that I know that there are science-minded people here who want me to now click this clicker and show you a slide with rates and frequencies and numbers and statistics and comparative species analyses. I can't do it. I wish I could do it. We are going to get there. But this is something that is a revolution in understanding animal emotion. And so right now, what I'm working to do is to bring together these scattered examples and build just such a comparative database. And in all honesty, I have to tell you that some examples are fuzzier. And I want to give you just a giraffe example. In Kenya, the Rothschild's giraffe is very beautiful, and they have been observed by Zoe Muller for quite some time. Zoe Muller noticed that a mother giraffe gave birth to a calf with a deformed foot. And the mom stayed with the calf much more than she did with the herd. And one day, when Zoe Muller got out of the Jeep, went to look at the giraffes, she noticed there were 17 females staring into a bush. Well, this is not normal behavior. And in that bush was the dead infant. And that afternoon, more females came, 23 females, standing quietly in a circle around. Males came. Now remember that the bull elephants never came to the grief context. Well, in this case, the males came. And what they did, and I promise I'm not going to joke about this, the males sniffed the reproductive state of the females and left. And the females stayed, and the males did not. So after 3 days, there was no more body. The predators had come and began to devour the infant. Is this grief? You know, we have lots of questions. What does grief mean to a giraffe? When animals are altering their behavior for days, acting differently, appearing to be in some sort of different state of expression and posture, this is a fuzzier example, but this is the type of thing that we need more and more examples of. So people ask me all the time, if we're talking about grief and I'm willing to entertain the idea of friendship and love, why would this have even occurred? Is it adaptive? And I think a lot about this. Grief may be essentially a chance to repair one's very damaged mind and heart, be able to go off and socially withdraw, get one's energy back, that type of thing, go out and find another partner, go out and perhaps rebond with other animals. Not to suggest that one animal is interchangeable with another, but that in social situations there is the need to recover. And this period of grief may be adaptive in sort of retooling and rethinking about what one is doing. All of these factors that I've written up here for you, phylogeny, social organization, habitat, population, individual life history, personality, we'd love to know how they play into who expresses grief and who doesn't. And 5 years from now, I hope somebody's standing up here and telling you the answers to these things. So I've talked about elephants, baboons, dolphins, and giraffes. And I'm going to make a jump. And I'm going to ask you to think about fish. Because one of the things that I think we can become guilty of is thinking that primates like us and mammals like us may be the animals who are profoundly feeling their lives, and maybe others aren't. Well, for the new book that Provost Halloran mentioned, Animals We Eat, that I have just finished, I have been looking into fish, octopus, insects. I ate insects for this book, which I'm not sure I'm going to repeat, but it was a very interesting process. And entomophagy is a very big deal nowadays. And I started reading about fish cognition. There was an article by Vail and colleagues that gave an example of something that just really blew me away. So there are 3 fish, groupers, wrasse fish, and also moray eels that hunt together collaboratively. So the groupers are very fast swimmers. They can stop on a dime, and they can put the jets on. They just really go fast. The eels are shaped in such a way that they can hunt in rocky crevices. And the wrasse fish have very strong jaws, and together they're able to get more food, eat other fish, than they would otherwise on their own. But here's the part that's interesting. When the groupers are hunting and the prey's escaping, which happens very often, and the prey's hiding in the rocks or hiding in the coral or hiding in some kind of a cave, this animal, the grouper, will go head down right above the place where the prey is positioned and shake the head and literally direct this head shake at its hunting partners. This is a referential signal. It is what we expect chimpanzees to do. It's what we expect dolphins to do. In other words, it's external reference to the environment through a voluntary motion that is directed at one's communicational partners. And so it's fascinating to see these fish. They put their heads down, they shake, and they literally look at their hunting partners, and then the hunting partners know where these fish are hidden. If fish can do that, can fish feel? We're not going to know until we ask. The very fascinating research lately certainly suggests that fish are sentient. Yes, they feel pain. Yes, they can suffer. And what we need to know now is more. I want to give you one more example of an animal that we don't know about yet, and this is the octopus, in this case, the veined octopus. And again, I've been working on understanding the cognition of these cephalopods. I spent time at the Virginia Aquarium in Virginia Beach watching a beautiful octopus have an enrichment session, manipulate objects, interact with the keepers, and that kind of thing. But the video that I want to show you is of a veined octopus. And this was filmed in Indonesia, in the wild, obviously, by Julian Finn. And what I'm going to show you is what happens when this octopus interacts with coconut shells. These are shallow waters, and coconut shells are thrown overboard, over boats. And the octopus is able to go and collect the coconut shell and then use them in some interesting ways. I never fail to laugh when I watch this video, and you'll see why after about 10 seconds. This octopus takes off with the most incredible gait of locomotion and has figured out how to make a shelter portable for itself, and this is a form of tool use. And off it goes. And these octopuses do this very frequently, and no one thought that they would be smart enough to figure out how to bring tools with them to shelter from predators. And I can go on with the examples of cephalopods, but this is not an octopus lecture, so I'll tear myself away. Again, I just want to tell you that the amount that we're finding in the last 10 years for either cognition or cognition and emotion is truly stunning. I want to talk about some farmed animals and make reference to Farm Sanctuary in Watkins Glen in New York, which is a wonderful organization that does rescue farmed animals. They're very much in the news lately. They often are. But I think that I want to focus on two ducks. I cannot help myself from giving this story when I talk about grief, because this is one of the stories that touched me the most when I found out about it. Harper and KOHL were two mallard ducks that were rescued by this organization from a foie gras factory in New York. They had, as you might not be surprised to learn, not been treated very well in this factory, and they arrived in sanctuary with deformed limbs, vision problems. They were very frightened of people, but they were fast friends, and I do use that word very intentionally. They spent time together, and they didn't spend time with other ducks so much, and they just seemed devoted to each other. At a certain point, KOHL's injuries became very painful, and the sanctuary folks decided that the best outcome would be humane euthanasia, and they did carry this out. But interestingly, they allowed Harper to watch. This is now a type of practice that's becoming much more prevalent in zoos as well. If a case of euthanasia has to occur, the animal's companions and family are allowed to watch, understanding that all of these emotions may be present. In any case, when this happened, Harper laid his body over KOHL's body, just draped his duck body right over his friend, and stayed there for some hours. The body, of course, eventually was removed. And the sanctuary workers were trying to interest Harper in other relationships with other duck friends or something like this. It didn't work. Harper took himself to the place on the farm sanctuary property where there's a pond, where he had spent hours with his friend. He was very clearly adopting depressed postures, acted very, very differently. Fits my definition of grief. And I would ask you, what do we gain in a case like this by refusing to use the word love or refusing to use the word friendship? Why is that anthropomorphism? Why is grief and love just, held for us? And unfortunately, it wasn't very long before Harper himself died. But people always ask me, don't these cases depress you? And of course they're sad. Of course I feel when I work on these things. But what is so important to me to feel and to convey is how much love there is between animals in these situations. And again, I'm not worrying too much tonight about the difference between friendship and love. But let me tell you, these are not bonds that are just there in a Darwinian context for reproductive success. There's something more going on. I mentioned cats, did I not? In Gloucester County, we have 6 cats in our house, 2 in the yard, and is it 9? 9 in this wonderful pen that my husband, who is here in the front row, has built for them. And for all the labor and love that went into that and for many other things, I thank my husband, Charlie. You know, there's this very strange myth about cats, right? They're aloof. They don't feel. They're there to control you. You are their masters and you feed them, and the dogs are all loyal and wonderful. Well, I don't buy this at all. I mean, there's some cats, yeah, let's face it. There's always one, right, in every house. I have one of those. But there's an emotional richness to cats as well as to dogs. Now, one of the cats that I have been the closest to in my life was named Pilar, and she lived from 1999 to 2014. During the winter of 2013 to 2014, I spent a lot of time on this particular red couch at my house in Gloucester. I was not here on campus. I was undergoing surgery and extensive chemotherapy and extensive radiation. And this cat, who had been very tuned into me all along and would pay attention to me, absolutely upped her game. She really took care of me in the sense of tuning into my moods. And I'm completely convinced that she was aware of my altered physical and emotional state. She parked herself on this couch on days when I was feeling bad one way or another. And this got me to thinking a lot about the capacity of cat, attunement and cat emotion. And I want to tell you about a story from my friends Ron and Karen Flo, who are here in the audience tonight. I can't see anyone, but I know they're out there. And they had 2 cats named Carson and Willa. These cats were sisters, and they were Siamese cats who spent 14 years together. And I want to describe a little bit of what happened. Carson one day became ill and had to go to the veterinarian's office and was put in an incubator and unfortunately did not come home the next day. She died overnight. And originally, her sister Willa did seem a little bit out of sorts. But then something happened that was much more than that. Within 2 or 3 days, Karen says, Willa started acting bizarrely. She was looking and looking for Carson. She began emitting these sounds that we had never heard from her, that I have never heard from any animal, as a matter of fact. If I'm going to be literary, I've read Irish literature. It talks about keening for the dead, and keening sounds like the closest to what she was doing. Willa was searching all the time, and all of a sudden she let out this horrific, well, Karen's voice trails off and then picks back up. So, if you're a skeptic, if you're one of these people in the A crowd, the anthropomorphism crowd, you'd say to me, oh, look, this is a cat who's just picking up on emotion in the household. We have no way to know if this is grief. But I'm here to tell you that this cat was distressed in a prolonged way, past the time of real visible grieving of Homo sapiens, of the humans in the household. And I have now talked to many, many cat people and many dog people, and we now know that these animals do feel grief. Now, this doesn't mean they all feel grief. I just want to add a little note. Sometimes a cat or a dog, when there's a companion, a same species animal in the house, dies, they're overjoyed. They get more of everything, more attention. They go up in the hierarchy. They get more treats. They're running around and they're delighted. So it really depends on the circumstance, and it depends on the personality. So I used to get people calling me up and saying, my dog's not grieving. What's wrong with my dog? And I would say, well, every animal is different. So I'm not making a prediction based on individuals. I'm talking about capacity. And I'm hoping that during the question and answer session, a dog person might want to tell. I would bet with a crowd of this size, there's someone who's had a grieving dog. It just is very, very common. So my point here is that we want to talk about wild animals, but we also want to talk about farmed animals and companion animals. Now, what about this whole issue of human exceptionalism? I want to mention 2 books that I've just read. They both came out earlier this year. One by Carl Safina, who's an ecologist, one by Jonathan Marks, who's an anthropologist. And they come to virtually polar opposite conclusions about the question of continuities versus human exceptionalism. Carl Safina writes about animal thinking and feeling and says that animals know who they are, they have a sense of themselves, they know who their family is, they know their place in this world and dynamically carve out this emotional place for themselves. Jonathan Marks, on the other hand, says that right in the beginning of the book, proudly plants his flag for human exceptionalism. Human meaning-making is different, he says. We live in a social historical universe, and we are verbal creatures. We have history, and we are just different, period. Well, sometimes, because I'm an anthropologist and I'm an animal researcher, I feel like I'm walking a high wire act between these two rather brilliant, not only books, but also perspectives in anthropology. But you know, that's one of the things that I love about anthropology, is that we look holistically at humans. We look from different subfields: archaeology, sociocultural anthropology, linguistics, biological anthropology, and all of these perspectives matter in my field. And so what I'm here to say is that it's not either or. We can see that there are human uniquenesses, and at the same time, we can see that there are profound continuities. So how is human mourning different? Well, we clearly have, for quite a number of millennia, burial rituals. Now, I have an example here of literal interment in a grave, but I know from talking to my anthropological colleagues that it's not always burial that populations use to deal with their dead in some ritualistic manner, but I'm using that as an example. Here we have an example of a grave from 26,000 years ago in Russia, where there was a community effort to make jewelry and adorn both adults and infants with jewelry in some kind, we don't know exactly the details, some kind of community ceremony. They were adorned in these graves that were very carefully dug. So, okay, that's 27,000 years ago. 100,000 years ago, our species was already using red ochre, the type that you see in the famous cave paintings, to adorn bodies, to do something symbolic and decorative around bodies. Our cousins, the Neanderthals, certainly sometimes buried their dead as well. We don't have evidence of this type of thing at all in any systematic and sustained way occurring in animals. Certainly, human grief is verbal and it's artistic. We turn our grief into art, sculpture and dance and drama and writing and painting and narrative. And I just picked one painting here for you to symbolize this point. But we, as a culture, make meaning in different ways. And this is important to acknowledge. Sometimes it's particularly important to say that there are cases when it's a good thing to draw a boundary. And an example that I can give you is about monumental architecture and the idea that we humans, of course, can mourn people we've never met, people who have lived in other times and in other places. Twice, when I was in Berlin, I visited the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe and found it an extraordinarily moving occurrence for me. Of course, I did not personally know the people that were being memorialized, but I felt their suffering and I thought about them in ways that spanned time and spanned space. I have had both in print and verbally an interesting difference of opinion with a researcher named Gay Bradshaw, who believes that elephants today, because they're under great stress from poaching and from habitat destruction, are undergoing an elephant holocaust. Here's where I would like to draw a boundary. I don't believe that they are comparable situations. I don't believe it makes sense to talk about an animal holocaust. There was incredible suffering of which, of course, as you all know, generations of people were acutely aware. The anticipation of what was happening to them and to their families existed in ways that we simply don't find in animals. I want to keep an open mind in very many ways about what we may find in animals. But my real point here is it doesn't do elephants any favors to make them into people. They're not people, and they don't have to be understood as profoundly feeling their lives. So the reality of animal grief is that it's not dependent on a concept of death. It's not dependent on a human standard. It's not dependent on what we do. Animal grief is nonverbal. It can be searing and its own phenomenon apart from what we do. And this is why I want to try to use the knowledge that we as a collective, all of us working on this, are gathering to work to better animal lives. I think of it as ripples of emotion. We know when there's dolphin slaughter in Taiji Cove in Japan that the animals suffer. We know that when animals are confined to very small tanks, when they are large, sentient, thinking and feeling cetaceans, that animals suffer. What we sometimes don't think about is the type of perspective I'm talking about here tonight, when the animals from whom they are separated, their friends and their kin and their loved ones, also suffer from that separation. I have been working on some issues specifically dealing with monkeys in biomedical laboratories, specifically in the United States. And here is a small rhesus macaque that was photographed at a laboratory in NIH, where there are still experiments that are called maternal deprivation experiments. You've all heard of these because we all know that Harry Harlow did them in the 1960s. You take infant monkeys from their mothers, you put them with wire or cloth mothers in the case of Harry Harlow in the past, and then you stress them and you find out what they do. Well, as animal models for psychopathology, some labs are still doing this, and I find this to be quite shocking and really an unnecessary use of animals, and I want to think about the emotional suffering that happens when infants are taken from their mothers, caged in small cages where they can see and hear other monkeys but have no cage mates with them and certainly no mothers with them. These are mammals, these are primates, they are adapted for life in a family, they are adapted to feel maternal love, and they're not doing this. So I have spoken on the Hill about this issue. On the right slide there you see James Cromwell, some of you may know from movies and television, who's a wonderful animal activist. I had the chance to review a large number of documents and some hours of video, well, maybe not hours, some footage of video that was obtained by the Freedom of Information Act by the animal organization PETA. I reviewed them myself, and I was very distressed by what I was seeing, and we brought this information to Congress. I've written also about this in the same model of understanding animal suffering for Scientific American this past summer, that experiments that separate infant monkeys from their mothers do cause profound and unnecessary suffering. So what I'm suggesting here is that we really need to make the research two parts: the data, understanding the data, and then using the data. Now, as I come to the conclusion of the talk, I do have two more sort of short sections that I want to speak about, because it's impossible to think about these topics without asking the question, who are we eating? And this is the next book that I have in my current research project. And not only who are we eating, but who do we talk to about who are we eating? I have a picture here of a chicken, and in fact, I mentioned to you at the start that a lot of the grief and love data that I have found, and I will very intentionally refer to it as data, come from goats and pigs and chickens, and not all goats and pigs and chickens. This is variable, as it is with any other animal. But when dairy cows or beef cattle have their infants taken away from them repeatedly, this type of thing, what I'm suggesting is that this is a conversation that we need to have, that we can't separate our food system from the fact that animals profoundly feel their lives. And by the way, I do think about other animals that I haven't talked about today, that I haven't included on my list. It's not just these animals, but many animals. So I have a colleague who's, I think, here somewhere, Brad Weiss, who works on issues around pastured pigs in Piedmont of North Carolina. And in an example of what we can learn by talking to people, I've learned a lot from talking to him, and I credit his son here for this wonderful picture of pigs at Cane Creek Farm in North Carolina. Brad's ethnographic work is talking about a food network at which pigs are the center, real pigs. That's the name of Brad's next book. And he wants to understand consumers and breeders and farmers and marketers and how they all come together around the sentient pig. And what I'm suggesting is that we shouldn't have divisive lines between groups who are interested in animals, that vegans and vegetarians can talk to farmers and breeders, that we can understand that sentient pigs are at the nexus of this food network, but that we can't only sort into our own groups and talk to each other. This is a very important thing that we're realizing. And of course, I'm talking about farms, that are small farms where the farmers are aware of the sentience of the animals. And we can debate what happens on those farms, but we know that they're different from factory farms for sure. Our choices can be compassionate. Just last week, Mark Bittman, who you all know is a food activist and food writer, said, eat more foods from the plant kingdom today than yesterday, this month than last month, this year than last year. Well, sure, I don't eat pigs, I don't eat chickens, I don't eat octopuses, I don't eat cows, and I feel strongly about that. But what I don't want to do is then say there's one way to talk about animal sentience, there's one way to talk about our humanity. We just need to keep talking to each other because the animal lives really depend on it. And I do hope that we are capable collectively of making the most compassionate choices that we can. So my take-home message tonight is that animal lives are important in and of themselves, that this matters to the animals, and that we're surrounded every day by animals who are thinking and who are feeling. And I promised myself that I could take just a few minutes and talk about some of my own emotions, and I'm going to do that now. First of all, I want to thank people, lots and lots of animals, including my own species. I want to thank again Martha and Carl Tack. I want to thank Kathleen Bragdon, who was my department chair for many years and who nominated me to give this lecture. And I wouldn't be here if she hadn't done that. Thank you, Katie. I also really want to take a minute and say there's an amazing team of people. I call them the TAC team. I don't think they call themselves that, but who work really long hours. I mean, I really had no idea quite until I went through this experience. And let me tell you, 48 hours before a lecture changing the venue, not the easiest thing in the world to do. So I'd like to thank Brian Whitson, Joseph McLean, Steve Tewksbury, Justin Schoonmaker, Alyssa Whitehead, Jeff Herrick, and I'm sure, I apologize, I've forgotten some people, but you've been awesome and you've made all the difference to me, and I really hope that we can all recognize that. I have to say a word about our students. My gosh, I have students here. I can see some of you. I know that you're here for my classes. Okay, some of them had to come. Okay, I made them, but not all of them had to come. I've been here since 1988, and it has been an incredible privilege to teach these students. And I have this wonderful article in the William & Mary News about what we call the primatology network. People like Peter Fasching, who started here in the 1990s, and many others who've gone from places as far as Africa and Puerto Rico to study different animals, who've become part of my life and my network. And it's just been wonderful. So I want to say that I'm dedicating this to my mother. We all have felt grief, right? We all have felt love. My mother died in April. She would love to be here. She is pictured here in the pink next to me at an African park. And it's really due to my parents that I'm here at all. I am a first-generation college student. They always gave me books and wonderful opportunities, and I just miss her, and I want to dedicate this talk to her. And lastly, I have to say, you know, William & Mary, I came here in 1988. I'll never forget it. I wanted to be here. And when I was hired, I was told, we'll take you for a year. Well, guess what? It was a really, really good year. And the years sort of piled up, one on top of the other. And it feels very surreal to me right now because I will stop teaching in December. This is a choice that I have made. I am going to switch to full-time science writing. I'm going to miss my students and my colleagues very, very much. I can't tell you how much. And I just want to end with a profound note for everyone at William & Mary who has supported me and who has been so wonderful to teach with a very, very big thank you. No, I'm fine. We can just continue. Thank you.